2020 National Conference, New Frontiers in Diplomacy and National Security. Our annual conference usually brings you all to Washington, D.C. for 3 days at the Mayflower Hotel. We'll be all virtual this year. We will be for 1 week instead of 3 days. And it's a great pleasure to present this think tank panel to you because over the past 5 years or so, one of the most popular features has been our in-person exclusive briefings at Washington, D.C. think tanks. Before I introduce our panelists today, and they are a very distinguished panel indeed, I want to express WACA's gratitude in a number of ways. First of all, to our co-chairs, Glenn Kramer and Roman Papaduke. We are executing an excellent and smooth transition from one co-chair to another, but in the time of COVID, to have them both through the start of this conference is terrific. Secondly, I want to thank our board of directors and those who have sustained us through this difficult financial phase that all of us are experiencing. Our staff has been incredible. Liz Brailsford, Laura Duncan, who assumed the role of Director of Communications just 3 weeks ago, and also our interns, Renika, Soha, and Kimberly. Thanks to you for doing a great job to get us going. And last but hardly least is our sponsors. We're particularly grateful to our principal sponsors, the Gambrinus Company, State of Qatar, and the Embassy we work with so closely, Philip Morris International, Johnson & Sterling, the Korea Foundation, as well as our friends at Global Ties, Daily Chatter, and the Foreign Policy Association. Thanks to all of you also for supporting us by actually showing that the financial model of virtual conferencing works and buying your tickets to be here today. We promise we will deliver a fantastic week to you. So with that, I want to get started with our panel. The topic is the big think, reinventing America's role in the world. And we are in a very historic and unusual point in our nation's history. The pandemic is, of course, raging. We are near 250,000 lives lost. We have an equal disease, really a cancer on the body politic that's emanating from the White House and a refusal to acknowledge the election victory of President-elect Joseph Biden. This is a continuing assault on democracy. It has gone from before the election through a misinformation campaign till now, and it is highly destructive. At the same time, just to take one international event, China over the weekend has inked a pact with 14 Asian nations, including Japan and New Zealand. This is cementing its influence at a phase where we could have had such an agreement, but both Congress and the president discarded it at the beginning of the administration in 2017. So to discuss these and other issues, I am so delighted to present the heads of 4 think tanks. John Allen has been president of the Brookings Institution since November 2017. He's a retired U.S. Marine Corps 4-star general and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Highlights of his 4-decade military career, as well as his post-career service as special envoy and special advisor on Middle East issues, are on our conference website. I'll merely say now that he and Darrell West, also of Brookings, are co-authors of Turning Point, Policymaking in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. The book came out this summer. William Burns is president of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the oldest international affairs think tank in the United States. Ambassador Burns retired from the U.S. Foreign Service following a 33-year diplomatic career. He is the only, he holds the highest rank in the Foreign Service, career ambassador, and is the only the second serving career diplomat to become Deputy Secretary of State. We were really pleased to feature Ambassador Burns for his book, The Back Channel, A Memoir of American Diplomacy and the Case for its Renewal, when it came out in 2019 for our cover-to-cover series. Jane Harman is from Los Angeles. She's a public school graduate. She went on to become a 9-term member of Congress, serving several decades on the major security committees of the House of Representatives. Drawing upon a career that has also included service in President Carter's Secretary of the Cabinet, she has served on numerous boards and government panels, including on the Executive Committee of the Trilateral Commission, the Advisory Board of the Munich Security Conference, and others. In February 2011, she resigned her congressional seat to become the first female director, president, and CEO of the Wilson Center. Richard Fontaine is Chief Executive Officer of Center for a New American Security. He served as president of CNAS from 2012 to 2019, after which he became CEO. And prior to that, he was an aide to Senator John McCain. He was a senior foreign policy advisor to the McCain 2008 campaign. And Richard has worked at high levels in the National Security Council and the State Department with Richard Armitage. And he is also an executive director currently of the Trilateral Commission. Good to see you, Richard. Good to see you, Jane, Bill, and John. And I'm going to introduce now our moderator for today's panel. That's Beverly Kirk. She is fellow and director of outreach at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she's also director of Smart Women, Smart Power, an initiative that has an eponymous podcast. Beverly previously was director of Ideas Lab, the multimedia production and design studio at CSIS, and she has a career prior to that in journalism, working with NBC, NPR, and PBS. Couldn't ask for a better moderator or a better panel to think big about America's new role in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the panel.
Bill, thank you so much. And thank you all to the panel for being here. Before we jump into the conversation, just want to remind those of you who are watching to remember to put your questions in the YouTube chat box live, and we will get to questions from the audience a bit later in the conversation. Well, to the panel, the first question that I have for you, since the theme of our conversation is reinventing America's role in the world, what is that role now as we transition from President Trump to President-elect Biden? Let's start with you, Jane.
Well, to the other woman on this panel, let me express my undying affection for the members of this panel. We've worked together forever. We care about each other. I think that Zoom is the least bad medium available, but personal hugs would be a lot better. So I'm sending, however I can, my personal hugs to very dear friends. And I don't know who's in the audience, but you may be dear friends too. But I know the three men on this panel are very dear friends. So while I'm on this woman thing, let me just say too, Beverly, that one of the pieces of good news, in case anyone missed it in this very long election season, is that there are 14 more women in the House of Representatives. Many of them are Republicans, which is just fine with me. They are women, and women are very good problem solvers. And so couldn't we just imagine that my former place of employ could actually work on solving problems for the American people instead of throwing grenades at the other side? I'll leave it there. So what do we have? What now? I would say that it's kind of early to know what now. There are a couple of good indicators, which are that Biden, who did win this election, let's get there, and most people are ready to get there, but not everybody, is the un-Trump. And that's of great notice around the world. I mean, he really is. Everything is different. He's long experience in foreign policy, very strong bipartisan relationships in Congress, character traits that I think, for me, are enormously appealing. Spoiler alert, I have endorsed Joe Biden. I did it shortly before the election, and I'm very happy that he's won the election. But at any rate, there's that. On the other hand, I think, and one more thing, I think that Biden, and this relates to this panel, especially to Bill, Biden will invest in soft power, which has been shorted by the Trump administration. And the projection of soft power across the world in so many ways will be so welcome. And just maybe we'll get back into various agreements, I hope. But now, what's the downside? The downside is this continued refusal to respect the results of the election, and are not just imperiling our national security. I'm sure others will talk about that because of the lack of the beginning of the transition. But they're also communicating to millions of people who supported President Trump, which was their right, that Biden is an illegitimate, or will be an illegitimate president. And that issue about his legitimacy is going to hobble some of his effectiveness, including in Congress, where those millions of people are going to contact their representatives and say, don't do anything with Biden. And it will, at least, it seems to me, take a while to work through that. So I think that's the beginning of the answer.
And now I want each of you to answer this question before we dive into to more reactions to the Biden presidency and the reaction of our allies and adversaries. So let's go to you, Bill.
I think, Beverly, you and Jane both used the right term, which is reinvention of America's role in the world and American foreign policy, in the sense that I do think we've been entering, over the course of the last decade, a new era on the international landscape, which isn't any big surprise. The era that some people called the unipolar American moment, the first 20 years, after the end of the Cold War, was meant to be a permanent condition. But this new era, I think, is marked by several features. One is, our major shift in the balance of power among states, especially with the rise of China. Second is the reality that, we see a growing number of challenges that go beyond the reach of any one state, whether it's climate change, the revolution of technology, global health. And then third and not least, major uncertainties about the role of the United States, the main driver of the old international order, now seen by too many people around the world to be drunk at the wheel, adrift in our domestic dysfunctions right now. And so I don't think that any of that is an argument for despair on the part of Americans. I think if you take a step back, the United States still has a better hand to play, at least I think, than any of our major rivals. And I say that not just because of our continuing economic and military, but especially because of our capacity to draw on alliances, to invest in partnerships, to mobilize coalitions of countries and help to set standards and rules of the road in the world. That capacity really does set us apart from lonelier powers, at least up until this point, like China and Russia. The question really is how well or how poorly we play that hand. I think it's been played especially poorly over the last 4 years. The kind of not only erratic unilateralism of President Trump, but also the self-dealing in his administration, which has been kind of the gift that keeps on giving to autocrats like Putin. But also, his tendency to continue to corrode democratic governance at home. So, we're in a deep hole, but as, a former boss of mine and Richard Fontaine's used to tell me, when you're in a deep hole and you want to get out, the first thing you should do is stop digging. Right. On November 3rd, we stopped digging. Now we got to start climbing out of that hole before the landscape at the surface hardens against our interests and against our values.
John?
Well, it would be difficult to improve on what Jane or Bill said, but first let me echo Jane's comment. It is so wonderful to see so many dear friends on one screen. As you say, there's many other dear friends out there, Jane, but boy, the three I'm looking at are precious to me. Let me just make several comments. In President Trump's inaugural address, about the third paragraph, he stepped back from one of the most important things that the United States does, which is embrace our values for human rights, and then enunciated America first. So we stepped away from our human rights commitment and we set ourselves on a course of isolation. And that's been very difficult to deal with. Now, as Bill and Jane said, we have gotten ourselves into a hole because of those two things. But then here's the good news. There is an enormous pool of talent around the former vice president, the president-elect. An enormous pool of talent. And I have great confidence that that team will be able to understand the strategic environment into which this administration will be launching and set us on a course internationally in particular to reestablish the kinds of relationships that we had in the past, relationships based on respect and partnership, not on some form of bullying or bilateralism. Or transactionalism. I think the people around Joe Biden truly understand that America's greatest strength has come from a foreign policy that is based on transformational values. And I think that we're poised to do that. The other thing I would say, and Bill alluded to it, I get the question frequently, what is the greatest threat that the United States faces in the 21st century? And people are surprised when I say it's climate change. Because so much of what will emerge from climate change, the realities of the environment, are a true and immediate threat to the United States. And you only had to watch this year's fire season and the hurricane season and the violent storms for us to see that the world is changing dramatically. So we have to first understand that just the environment is a challenge for us. And then beyond that, we have to understand what American leadership in the 21st century truly will look like. And first, I'll say it has to be based on multilateralism. It has to be based on respect. It has to be based on our commitment to, when we join something, that we're transformational in our presence. The whole of us are greater than the sum of the parts, because America is part of this. And we have to understand that while we'll have adversaries, and we shouldn't compromise our values when we deal with adversaries, they have to understand that the United States will draw the line on certain things. And that we will be, what we really contribute in this world are two great things. One is convening power because of the strength of our values and the strength of what we stand for. And the other is a global reach. In fact, the most powerful force on the planet, beyond the forces of nature, is the American economy. Not the American military, but that's pretty powerful too. And so at this particular moment, the United States has enormous capacity, led by Joe Biden, with such great credibility around the world, to begin to harvest the goodwill of the democracies around the world, to create a transformational community of democracies committed both to dealing with the issues of climate change, but also to deal with the issues of illiberalism, massive violation of human rights, and also to deal with the authoritarians. And we can talk later. I think we're going to get to some of the specifics, but I think I'm actually quite optimistic. My fear is that after making multiple changes, which really needs to right the ship, we've been listing badly, my maritime background, we've been listing badly over the last 4 years. I think Joe Biden will right the ship. My fear is in 2024, what that's going to mean in terms of, once again, signaling that we're changing course again. So this is going to be a really important 4 years to lock in these trajectories for the United States in the future, because our allies just saw the worst possible outcome of a United States that withdraws from the world. Joe Biden's going to restore that confidence. We've got to lock that confidence in as we go forward.
And we will get to some of those points that you mentioned, but let me first get Richard's thoughts on just the opening question about America's role.
Sure. I thought Bill really nicely laid out the way the external environment is changing. And I think implicit, or maybe even was explicit in there, is the notion that the Biden team is not going to have as a task restoration. It's got to be renewal. There's not a return to just the 4 years ago status quo ante on China and trade and all these other issues, because the country's changed and the world is changing. And Bill talked a little bit about the way the world's changing. One thing, though, I think that's worth keeping in mind is how at least a significant portion of the American population is seeing its own views of some of these issues change. I mean, like my colleagues, I'm not a fan of President Trump, but he did do one service to all of us in the sort of foreign policy world, which is he made us think a lot harder than we had been thinking before that. And it turns out that there's a large portion of the American electorate, it's not clear to me it's a majority, but a large portion that believes that trade agreements kill American jobs, including theirs, and are coming after jobs. That the so-called forever wars means that the sons and daughters they send disproportionately into those wars will go off for a kind of a fruitless exercise of expensive blood and treasure. That our allies take advantage of us. That immigrants are coming to grab jobs or change culture, things like that. And that ultimately globalization just has worked out well for a coastal elite, but not for them. And we could talk forever about those claims and whether some of it's right and some of it's wrong. But there is a group of Americans, and it's pretty big, that believe that they've lost out on globalization, and they're willing to vote to some degree on that basis. And the problem that Trump has had is he kind of got the diagnosis right, but the prescriptions have been terrible. Most of his prescriptions would make those things worse, not better. But because that diagnosis is out there, part of what I think the next team is going to have to do, and actually Joe Biden may be kind of genetically programmed to do this, given his background and the fact that, he's been connected to kind of the working class people of Delaware, his career and things like that, is to connect all these things that we want to do in the world, the leadership, the multilateralism, the generosity, the diplomacy, all this stuff, to the everyday concerns of Americans, and particularly that large cohort of Americans that can't quite see how that stuff translates into benefits for them.
All of you in your opening remarks there mentioned the current transition and the issues that are rising because the current administration is not cooperating, at least not as yet, with the incoming administration to make for a smooth transfer of power. So can you talk about the risks that this may pose in terms of what may happen at the Pentagon, what may happen at the State Department, what may happen in the intelligence community, and what may happen in Congress? I know each of you is an expert in these areas. So Richard, since you spoke last, let's have you go first this time around and talk about what this may mean perhaps in the intelligence community, the fact that, the smooth transition has not yet started.
Yeah, there's a couple of problems. One is that the 9/11 Commission in its report pointed to the fact that there was a truncated transition in 2000 because of the Bush v. Gore cases as one reason why the incoming team was not as prepared as it should have been for national crises, including terrorism. So that's a pretty real world example of the kind of things. The longer you put this transition off, the shorter the amount of time the transition team and the incoming team has to understand the policies, the programs, the budgets, get briefed up on things, think about things before their inbox is overflowing and they have to make decisions and things like that. Some people have said, well, this is kind of, then you get into the fact that the decapitation of the Pentagon's leadership, Gina Haspel may or may not have very much long to go in her role and so forth. And people say, well, Russia or China could take advantage of that kind of uncertainty. And that's possible, but frankly, I sort of doubt it. To me, the bigger issue is things happen in the world, and any 2-month period, you're going to have a crisis, small, medium, or large. It could be the civil war in Ethiopia. It could be whatever. And this administration has already shown it's not terribly well equipped to deal with crises, unexpected crises. It's not very good on process, discipline, messaging, things like that. Now you have people that literally started yesterday at the heads of some of these national security agencies, which only makes it that much harder, and they are going to be in power for another couple of months. So that's the thing. I fear the kind of unknown crisis that's going to pop up, and they'll be even less equipped to deal with it than otherwise.
And let's go to you, John, at the Pentagon. The leadership there is brand new. Yeah,
Richard hit it well. It's not only brand new, it's not very good, frankly. And that's a problem. I mean, one of them couldn't get confirmed because of his Islamophobia. Here's my fear. First of all, you don't trifle with the leadership of the Pentagon. That's got to be an entity because of national command authority. The chain of command goes from the president through the Secretary of Defense right to our warfighting commanders. And when you disrupt that in the final moments of an administration, you really create, as Richard said, the potential for crisis, particularly if they're not experienced and they're not well informed on the issues, et cetera. So that's the first thing. It's a crisis response problem, which I think we've just created for ourselves. And it can be very bad very quickly, particularly if there's a nuclear dimension to it. The second is there's a theory out there that the president is setting the conditions for a more precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, first of all, the peace deal that this administration engineered for Afghanistan is abysmal. It's an awful relationship, which if nothing else, it leaves the entire female population of Afghanistan at risk to the outcome. Number one. Number two, if we really believe that the Taliban will ultimately break their relationship with Al-Qaeda, which was one of the principal reasons for us to stipulate we were leaving, we need to reconsider that. I'd give you some other options, but we really need to consider that. And this is the moment when the president should leave this alone. He's got 65 days left in office, and to tamper with the timeline or to tamper with a force structure that is tied into our Afghan and Iraqi partners that are playing a very important role from moment to moment. We need to leave that alone. In fact, a responsible commander-in-chief would say, I'm going to leave all of those hard decisions to the next commander-in-chief, which he ought to do. We're 65 days out. Accelerating that withdrawal will destabilize the peace agreement. It will create greater crisis for the Ghani regime, or the Ghani administration in Afghanistan, as it attempts to negotiate the intra-Afghan agreement with the Taliban. And it will make it much more difficult for the Iraqis. So that's a second theory. I've also heard that there might be some considerations on one more attempt to push the Iranians back with the potential for some military action there. I haven't seen any indications of that, so I don't put that forward. The last thing I'll say, though, is, look, Mark Esper, he did a pretty good job of holding that place together. You know, Secretary of Defense is sort of riding the tiger at any given moment. He's got every military potential crisis in the world. He's got an enormous business enterprise to run. He's trying to modernize the forces. And I think Mark Esper did a good job doing that. But he got on the south side of Donald Trump for one important reason. When he stood up to the president, when the president intended to deploy federal forces to be used against American citizens in the streets last summer, he did that for the right reasons. We don't do that in America. We don't deploy American federal forces. That's what the National Guard's for. That's what law enforcement is for. They work together at a local level to solve the problems. But the first solution was get the 82nd involved in this. And the 82nd Airborne is a great organization, but it has no business clearing American streets unless everyone else has lost control. Mark Esper stood up against that, and it got on the south side of the president. Now, my big concern is if something goes really wrong in the next 65 days, that voice and other voices in the department at the civilian level are now gone. And there might be less opposition to the president attempting to use military force if necessary to try to control civil disturbances. I hope that's not the case, but that's why Mark Esper, and the president was very clear about it, that's why Mark Esper got on the south side of the president on this matter. So whether it's an accelerated withdrawal, which he shouldn't do, he should leave that to President Biden, or whether it's to set the conditions ultimately to how to deal with widespread civil unrest if something goes south in the next 65 days. I'm very worried. You don't do this to the Department of Defense, and you don't do it at the end of an administration.
Bill, what about at state?
Well, I think first in general, I mean, Richard's right in the way he framed this at the outset, recalling the 9/11 Commission and the dangers of, uncertain and late starts and transitions. I mean, I ran 2 transitions during my checkered career as a diplomat in the State Department, and an awful lot of effort goes into those things. And I'm sure there's going to be no lack of effort, but without the kind of leadership that can only come from the White House, you're asking for trouble, I think. The State Department itself is a pretty hollowed out and battered institution right now. I'd be the first to acknowledge that the drift predated Donald Trump, but he certainly made it a lot worse. I mean, the systematic sidelining of career expertise there. There are 28 Assistant Secretary of State positions, as my friends on the panel know very well. These are the jobs around which you organize Washington and at least a foreign policy in the State Department. Of those 28 Assistant Secretary of State positions, only 1 today is held by a career officer confirmed by the U.S. Senate. There's been a nearly 40% drop in the number of young people applying to join the U.S. Foreign Service today. The painfully slow and inadequate progress we made over many decades on diversity issues in the State Department and the Foreign Service have been set back. They've gone into reverse. So today you have the reality of 189 U.S. ambassadors around the world, only 4 today are Black Americans. And so, in all of those cases, you have a pretty battered institution right now. So that's what's over, an uncertain transition process, because it's going to take a lot longer to fix those problems than it's taken to break them. If I can, Beverly, one very quick point, which is simply to reinforce Richard's excellent point about the connection between domestic renewal and foreign policy. I don't think there's ever been a moment, at least in my adult lifetime, when that connection has been more important, because there is a very big disconnect today between people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment, and lots of American citizens who, when we preach the virtues of American leadership in the world, don't really need to be persuaded about the importance of American engagement, but they're skeptical about our capacity across party lines in Washington to be disciplined about how you conduct that. So I think that's going to be a really important priority in a new administration, is connecting foreign policy to domestic renewal, from pandemic and economic recovery all the way through to all the bigger issues we've been talking about, in ways that a skeptical American public can see and understand.
And last but not least, Jane, you were a congresswoman for a long time. What is it going to take on the Hill for members of the president's own party to try to help move the process along, to help the transition actually go more smoothly than it's gone so far?
Well, let me say how disappointed I am that more Republicans aren't speaking out. A number have. And I was reading a bunch of articles this morning about how my very good friend Susan Collins has been speaking out as one Republican member of the Senate. But come on, folks, you're elected, you take an oath to observe the Constitution, not your party. And the future of our country depends on a robust Congress, which over 3 presidencies, it's not just one, as several have pointed out, I'd say, or maybe 4, since the end of the Cold War, has been declining in its ability to get things done. Bill, you're right about foreign policy being a crucial focus, but I can tell you, as a member of Congress for 100 years, voters don't understand why foreign policy, most of them, why it matters. They think the foreign aid budget is half of our federal budget and needs to be reduced. It's 0.01% of our federal budget, by the way, and they don't get it. I would say right now, Joe Biden's slogan of Build Back Better needs to be applied not just to domestic policy, but foreign policy. And there is an obvious way to do this. If we're going to deal with the pandemic doesn't respect our national borders, and everything that goes forward, starting with immigration policy, but also the distribution of the vaccine, has to be done internationally. Pulling out of the WHO was ridiculous. And should the WHO be built back better? Of course it should. But the point is that we have to engage with the world on the pandemic response. So there's one connection between domestic and foreign policy. Second connection, on whatever our response is to our economic decline, again, that has to be international. We have to deal with China. We have to understand, we made, pointing to China, it was right, but the workout, as several of my friends have said, has been wrong. We have to engage with China, and we have to make globalization work for more people. That's why all these millions of people are so upset. They've been left out. It's globalization and technology that have worked for some, but the income inequality that has resulted in our country has been staggeringly large. And 3 administrations, at least 3, missed the movie. So it is really important that the Build Back Better piece be better inclusion. So I'm saying I think you can't really separate domestic and foreign policy. You have to do them both. Can Congress do that? Maybe sort of, kind of. Not at the moment. I think everything's frozen until this Georgia runoff occurs. And then even if the Republicans are in control, as I said earlier, those millions of people are going to push their members not to deal with Democrats, but just hopefully, if there's a good worldwide pandemic response and a good worldwide economic response attached to, let's start with the continuing resolution. We have to keep the government open. Let's not forget that. A lot of these millions will figure out, oops, maybe I saw the wrong movie. Maybe there is a way to work with other people and make my own life better.
You brought up a couple of things that I want to follow up on. I really want to get to the question of the middle class, the income inequality, and the feelings of half the country that they've been left out as globalization took off. And another point that was raised earlier about connecting foreign policy and the middle class.
Mhm.
How do you make that happen in a country that is so divided right now? I guess the bigger question is, how do you get the folks who are so convinced that the system as it is operating now that only benefits the elites on the coasts? How do you start the conversation to get to change things and to figure out a way to resolve that issue and bring people along? I grew up in the middle of nowhere in rural Kentucky, so I understand the part of the world that says we've been left behind. How do you change that? Because it seems like it's an aircraft carrier that's not going to change very fast.
Well, Beverly, I mean, I'm glad to start if you'd like. At Carnegie, over the last 2.5 years, we've run an initiative that, is aimed exactly at that question. I know my friends and colleagues have done similar initiatives in recent years too, but this is, focused on actually listening, which seems like an unnatural act in Washington sometimes. We heartland states far removed from the Washington Beltway in Ohio, in Nebraska, and in Colorado. And, they're not monoliths, as you all know very well. And as people in our audience from those states know well, I mean, the economies of those states vary in, a lot of important ways across a state like Ohio or Colorado. But what was interesting, and this was all managed by a bipartisan task force of, experienced Republican Democratic practitioners. And we did it with local partners like with Ohio State University in Ohio. But what this underscored, I think, is not only that sense of resentment that lots of people in the middle class had that you've all talked about so far, but also the kind of intuitive common sense of a lot of our fellow citizens as well. A kind of skepticism about grand new cosmic crusades, whether it's about, seeing everything through the prism of competition with China, a much more careful look at, the use of tariff instruments, because farmers in Nebraska, suffered as a result of that, even if there's a lot of enthusiasm for pushing back against predatory Chinese trade and investment practices. So what it underscores is what Jane said, which is that as we look at everything from trade to other forms of, sort of our engagement in the world, that looking at ways in which we can ensure that it promotes not just, the interests of major corporations or high-end earners, but, of middle-class citizens. It improves inclusive economic growth, which is an easy term to throw around, much harder to apply, but it's crucially important. And then to organize ourselves in Washington in a way that breaks down some of the silos between traditional national policy and domestic policy. And that's, I think, among the biggest of the challenges for the new administration.
We're getting lots of questions in here into the chat. Before I turn to those, you raised China, and we haven't talked a lot about China yet. So I want to put out the question, how do we square the circle with China as a potential adversary and someone who doesn't necessarily follow all the standard trade rules, but is a rising power to be reckoned with, both economically and militarily? Who would like to try that question?
Well, I'll start. The first thing is to have a comprehensive China strategy. We didn't have one really in the last administration, although people might point to one. It wasn't executed as one. For example, our East Asia partners were frequently given a choice to decide between the United States and China. And for those diplomats who are listening, or those who've done business in East Asia, that's a losing proposition. Right. First thing we have to do is have a relationship with China, which of course is based on our values. And second, we need to hold the Chinese accountable for the predatory trade practices. And so that really shouldn't change. But for a whole variety of purposes, I think for domestic consumption and ultimately to assist him in the re-election campaign, this administration pursued a very confrontational relationship with China. And a little experience at this, you call someone your enemy long enough and pretty quickly they'll start to act as your enemy. And there are many ways that a responsible relationship with China, a constructive relationship with China, can deal with these issues about predatory trade practices, can deal with issues about our never compromising our values, but also can find areas where there are cooperative or collaborative opportunities for a relationship. And we really need to find that. There are some issues that we're going to face in the 21st century that cannot be solved unless the United States and China are able to find a way to work together on it. So there are a lot of common interests that we might have, even though our values may not be the same. The other thing I would say is that the United States, again, I said a moment ago that we have two great things going for us. One is our capacity for global convening, our leadership, and the second is our global reach. Here's an opportunity in the 21st century for us to bring together the democracies. Those entities in the world, in East Asia, in the transatlantic relationship, that share our values, that share our economic systems, that are highly advanced in technologies, that share our system of government, and begin to work in a competitive way with the Chinese as opposed to a confrontational way with the Chinese, because that's been traditionally the way we've done it in this administration. And the problem in this administration is that's what we wanted of our partners, but we bullied them. We acted in a transactional way with them at the very moment we needed to create the capacity for us to compete with the Chinese. And Bill Clifford said at the very beginning, the Chinese just inked a deal that looked kind of like the TPP,
Right.
which was one of the most important processes that we put together for a very long time. Now, Congress didn't favor it, but Donald Trump walked away from it, but then pursued a whole series of potential or aspirational relationships that would have looked like the TPP. Yet the Chinese have now done it. So the relationship with China does not have to be confrontational, but we should not compromise our values. We should not let them off the hook. And we should ultimately seek those relationships with the Chinese that are cooperative and can be collaborative as we go forward.
Can I just add 30 seconds to that? I know you want to get to questions. The national security strategy of the Trump administration identifies China and Russia as strategic competitors. That's exactly right. And China, by the way, is not a rising power. It's a risen power. And as Bill said, we're now in a multipolar world and we just better get over ourselves. That's how it's going to be. So I think John has pointed to some good directions. I would just say something critical of the Democrats. Watch this. It's a bipartisan sport to bash China. Congress has been doing this for decades. And this is the time to get over that and focus on sensible strategic competition strategies and work together to do that.
Well said, Jay.
Maybe I can just add a slightly different perspective, which is I think American policy toward China for multiple administrations has been premised on the idea that the United States sort of sets the tone by its policies and rhetoric, and then China's behavior sort of responds one way or the other. So if we invite them to be a responsible stakeholder and we engage with them, then they will have more skin in the international game. They will become, they'll have a greater stake in institutions, and maybe even their domestic policies will liberalize over time, given the engagement. Or if we're really tough on them, then they're going to react as our enemy and they're not going to work with us and things like that. And I'm not sure that much of that is true. I don't think that we're just the independent variable and they're the dependent variable. I mean, they have agency. They concluded after 2008 and the global financial crisis, their time had come and that our time had passed. And Xi Jinping's ascension coincided with that. And, you know, the reality is we have, not just on trade, but on Taiwan, on economic coercion, on the South China Sea, on Uyghurs, on Hong Kong. I mean, the list of things that divide us is pretty long. This competitive nature of that relationship is pretty high. And so the kind of thought is, well, you know, Trump didn't want to cooperate with the Chinese on anything, so he wasn't encumbered. He could just do all out cooperation or confrontation. But we want to get, quote, back to a mix of cooperation competition. I'm pretty pessimistic that we're going to be able to cooperate very effectively. You know, we'd like to segment issues and say, well, we compete over here very fiercely, but we've got these issues over here, climate change and COVID and maybe North Korea, and we just pretend like we're friends. But I mean, COVID was like the meteor coming from outer space to hit the Earth. And yet, you know, it wasn't only the Trump administration's unwillingness to work with the Chinese that prevented the Chinese from working with us. So, I mean, the Chinese had their own approach to this stuff too. So I'm just pretty pessimistic. We should try to cooperate, but I think the reality is these issues are going to bleed into each other.
Let me come in right behind. I mostly agree with Richard. The one big thing that's changed is that Xi Jinping has accumulated more power around himself than any previous Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. And so there are great liabilities associated with his failure by having a relationship with us as well. And he's under a lot of pressure inside the country because a lot of Chinese oppose the kinds of accumulation of power and centralization of power that he's had. And that's a figure that we've not seen before. So as Joe Biden seeks to create a new relationship with China, or a revised relationship with China, or whatever it might be, that's going to be a figure that he will not have seen before.
Yeah.
Beverly, the only thing I would add very briefly to what's been said about China, mainly to Richard's point, is that I think Richard's right. I think, it's going to be very difficult to affect Xi Jinping's ambitions. I think there's a determination there over the medium and long term that's quite formidable on the part of this Chinese leadership. Where I think we can do things differently from the current administration is in affecting the environment, shaping the environment into which those ambitions play out. And that's where, as each of my colleagues have said, the United States still has considerable assets from India all the way across to our traditional treaty allies in Japan and South Korea. The problem, though, is you got to be able to compete, not just in security terms, you've got to be able to harness all those assets in diplomatic and economic terms as well. And therein lies the problem with the signing of the RCEP, the big new trade agreement with China at its center, and the continuation, thanks to the Japanese and some of our other partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So you have two big, region-wide economic organizations right now setting rules. And, the United States is not a part of either of them. And we talk about Indo-Pacific strategy, which is smart, and this administration has emphasized, but it's pretty striking that neither India nor the United States at either end of that Indo-Pacific strategy are part of either of those, trade and economic agreements that you just mentioned. And so you got to be able to compete against the whole, array of areas.
But just remember, I know you want to get to questions. Everybody fears China, but nobody wants to be China. And people don't fear us, but they all want to be us. So there's a huge opportunity for improvement here in terms of investment in soft power and trying to make Congress work again.
And now let me get to questions. I'm going to try to pair some of them up so that we can get in as many as possible. There are several on the issue that we talked about a moment ago in terms of foreign policy and connecting with voters. Mary Mendoza asks, how do you get the average voter to understand the importance of foreign policy? And then the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire says, what would you like to see the Biden administration do in the first 100 days on foreign policy to set a positive path forward?
Well, I'll throw a few of these out. I think one of the first things he should do is commit to the reinvigoration of the Department of State. My guess is he has a very rich roster of individuals that might take over the Department of State, and the leadership there will signal a very important trajectory for the United States. As Bill said, we've got to get our foreign service officers, our young foreign service officers into the game. We've got to get the confirmation process going. Our greatness as a nation, not Donald Trump's greatness, but the greatness as a nation has always been because we've got a foreign policy that's executed by a vibrant core of foreign service officers. We got to get that fixed right away. And I also think that in the first 100 days, the new president has got to be very clear and unambiguous on our commitment to multilateralism, an endorsement of the United Nations, stop our withdrawal from the World Health Organizations, return to UNRWA, which sets the conditions ultimately for another bite at the Middle East peace process. Return immediately to the Paris Climate Accord. Meet with our partners who were part of the JCPOA, the Joint Cooperative Plan of Action, joint whatever it was, JCPOA on Iran, and have a conversation with them about what's now possible in the conversation with Iran going forward to contain its nuclear program. Reinstate our commitment to NATO very clearly and unambiguously in support of Article 5, and ensure that the EU understands the United States supports the concept of the EU and the reality of the EU, and we remove any lingering doubt that, as this president said, the EU was our #1 foe. So I think very early in the 100 days, both in terms of action and appearance, this administration needs to commit to a foreign policy that is based on a reinvigorated State Department and our commitment to multilateralism.
All right, let's
Joint cooperative plan of action. Sorry.
very important. Our next question comes from Matthew Hughes. And the question is, with political, economic, and social instability ongoing in much of Latin America, not least Venezuela, Brazil, and the Northern Triangle, what priorities will the U.S. pursue in that region in the years ahead? Who would like to take that question?
Well, I'll say something. An agency we didn't discuss today was the Department of Homeland Security, which has been decimated by this administration and which is focused only on the southern border. That's its relevance to this question, and has engaged in some policies like separating kids from their parents and putting people in cages and basically creating squalor along the Mexican border that are just unacceptable. And I gather that the Biden administration is going to surge its focus on DHS to the border and a new immigration policy. That policy needs to be more than a border policy. We have had a good, it seems to me, blueprint since the George W. Bush administration, where I, for one, as then a member of Congress, voted for comprehensive immigration reform, which included earned legalization, not, I forget what that other term is that's wrong, for people, the 11 million people who've been here forever, and amnesty. It's a ridiculous term. It's almost like defund the police, which is also ridiculous. But anyway, reviving that, figuring out how to give targeted aid to Central America so that the push factor to push people through Mexico in dangerous circumstances to our border is relieved. We do have to focus on Venezuela. That is a huge problem. It's a failed state. And I think that Trump was right to focus on it. I think the execution has been horrible. And in addition to that, some of the other economic engines of South America are not doing as well as they were. So what do I think? I think that the questioner is right, that this is someplace that Biden needs to focus with a well-staffed State Department with a process for dealing with problems and an excellent Secretary of State. One of those possibilities for Secretary of State, by the way, is on this call. I'm just saying, he's probably going to say, who, me? But somebody with a phenomenal record is on this call, and who I would say, among a few other rock stars, would be just great.
All right, we have time for just a couple more questions, and I really want to get both of these in, so bear with me. Edward Martins is asking about imported oil, and do we see a realignment in the Gulf region and the Middle East? Richard, do you want to try that one?
Sure. I admit that I had been, there was this kind of peloton of foreign policy experts going around the velodrome who, for years, included me and said, we must care about the Middle East just as much as when we imported oil from the Middle East, because of course we care about the world price, and geopolitical events there affect the world price, and something happens over there, it's damaging to our economy, we got to care, blah, 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 blah. And I still kind of mostly think that. But the thing that woke me up was this breathtaking attack by the Iranians on the Saudi oil fields, which knocks off 50% of Saudi crude production in a stroke. And what happened to the price of oil? It went for a few hours and it settled right back down because there's so much excess supply in the market because of fracking, other forms of flexible supply. It may actually be the case that we don't need to care about the Middle East for energy reasons to the same degree that we did back in the Carter Doctrine, days and so forth. What that means is the hard part, because we care about other things in the Middle East too, right? We care about, the stability of governments and terrorism and Israel and, all these other kinds of things. So what that actually means in terms of our footprint, our military interventions, all these other things, and how we square that with the desire to spend more time and resources out in the Indo-Pacific, all of that remains to be seen. But at least in my mind, it opens up the potential for a new kind of thinking, rather than just, we have to care about the Middle East exactly as much as we ever did.
Can I say one thing about the Middle East, and that is to commend the Trump administration for getting Israel to back off the annexation of the West Bank. I know it took help from some Sunni governments, and for entering into two peace agreements with two countries with more to come. I think this is good. And I think we still have to focus on a two-state solution with a real Palestinian country living side by side with a safe Israel. But that was a good thing. And imagine the potential of a trading region in the Middle East with the resources they do have. Oil is a depleted resource, but think solar, think technology, think tourism, think history. I mean, it's spectacular. And wouldn't that help protect US security if we could, at least through the power of our example, help launch that?
And we have, we're actually out of time, but I do want to ask this one last question from the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and then Bill Clifford, I'll turn it back to you. With Jane hailing the even greater numbers of women in Congress, do we think we can finally expect our first woman Secretary of Defense?
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think that's
And I think we all know who that'll be.
Yeah, we know her. That's right. She'll be great. She's
Yep,
from
absolutely.
California, by the way. Beverly Hills, just saying. My rival high school. Okay. Anyway, never mind.
Not tracking. She's speaking of Michelle Flournoy. With that,
Yes, it is.
thank you so much. I want to turn it back over to Bill Clifford. You guys were wonderful, and I could keep talking to you for another hour, but unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Thank you,
Bill?
Beverly.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Great
you very
job.
much,
Well
Beverly.
done.
Yeah, excellent.
Beverly, thank you. And to the panel, my sincere and great thanks for a wonderful way to kick off our 2020 National Conference. We did feature Michelle Flournoy 2 years ago at our opening keynote, and we wish her well, whatever position she takes. I want to say that for card-carrying members of the Washington, D.C. establishment, you are all cool people and with cool heads, and we need that thinking around our country. We've done a good job. We could be better at engaging the four of you, and we will get Beverly on this too, in our councils around the country, both virtually and I hope someday soon again in person, because we really value getting you and all the people you lead in your institutions out of the Beltway and listening and talking to ordinary Americans about foreign policy and global issues. So my colleagues and those on the audience know that at just a half an hour from now, we'll be having our World Affairs Council annual membership meeting to discuss the business of and the nuts and bolts of making a nonprofits work better at this time. And then at 7 o'clock, we will present our opening keynote and our WACA International Service Award to Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Chair of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and have a great discussion on the pandemic. Join us then. Thank you all again to the panel, to my staff, and to our sponsors. So for Bill Burns, John Allen, Richard Fontaine, Jane Harman, and Beverly Kirk, good afternoon to you. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so